Yeah, I would strongly agree with that, and I do want to touch a little bit on your work on nationalism and on the proper role for the ethnic tribe inside of the nation. And so, in your book, The Virtue of Nationalism, you argue that nations with their own distinct language, culture, history are best positioned to govern themselves, as opposed to being subject to these sort of pan-national, imperial, globalist projects. I think this is another respect where your thought and your work is at odds a little bit with modern academia. I remember when I did my I remember when I did my I did a master's in international law in Europe in the early 2000s, and the prevalent ideology there, the vision, was that the UN and international treaties and universal human rights. And the whole ideal was of these post-ethnic states, right, where people from all ethnicities are equal citizens. So there's a positive vision as well, a vision of tolerance of people from different ethnicities. Everybody's protected by human rights, almost like the standard liberalism, like pre-2020, in pre-cultural revolution, right? And of course, people from all ethnicities have thrived and contributed in Western countries under this kind of framework. At the same time, this does put pressure on the values of certain groups that the nation states are based on to begin with. And you see that everywhere in the conservative movement. It's emphasis on a return to traditional values or the whole debate on immigration and so forth. Within your general view of nationalism, what's the proper place for the interests of, let's call it, the dominant ethnic group within a nation state per se? Is it a form of immigration policy? Is it best expressed in a form of cultural policy? I ask this because in some countries, for example, in many Arab states, the state can be explicitly structured in a way that is beneficial to one tribe or ethnic group over others. And I don't think that's what you mean in your argument. And so how do you kind of reconcile the interest, the values of a dominant ethnicity within your concept of a modern nation state?
I don't believe that there are neutral states, and I don't believe that there is a neutral international law. Whether you're talking about the
Mm.
laws of a particular national state, a particular nation state, or whether you're talking about what's claimed to be international or universal law. By the way, it claims to be based on treaties. International law isn't really based on treaties. What it's based on is professors in universities, especially in law faculties, but also in other departments. Professors internationally gathering together, coming up with what a consensus is for what they think law should be. And then they just simply declare that to be the law. And many judges, a very, very large proportion of judges in many places, um, simply accept whatever the professors dictate the laws to be.
It's one of the sources, but there's also treaties, right? So governments at some point also agree that, okay, we're going to sign this treaty, even if it's not going to be sometimes enforceable. But there's also like a political dimension to it as well. But yes, it's true that the opinions of the scholars is actually a source of international law. Yeah.
I agree with you that that there is such a thing as treaties between countries, and I do think that those treaties should be between countries, should be binding under most, if not all, circumstances. But somebody needs to interpret the treaties, and the people doing the interpreting are professors and judges. And as the years go on, with every passing decade, those professors and judges are much more confident in ignoring the letter of the treaty and simply arguing. In Israel, we have a famous Supreme Court justice named Aaron Barak, who famously declared that the standard for adjudicating any question is reasonableness. That is, whether he thinks something is reasonable. And as soon as you're there, the agreements between countries they become more and more window dressing. That's where I think we're proceeding.
Reasonableness. The more subjective you get in your standard, the more it actually points to the authority of the person who will deem reasonability, right? So the less you have objective constraints, the more it's really about who's making the decision.
Exactly so. So to go back to your question about ethnicities, first I should say the word ethnicity is it's a variant of the Greek ethnos. Ethnos just means nation. It doesn't mean race. It's not biological. The Greeks knew there was such a thing as a Greek ethnos, just like the Jews knew that there was such a thing as Am Yisrael, as a goy kadosh that was the Jews. The traditional view, like the view of what a nation is, an ethnic group that has been that most times in most places in history, certainly in the biblical literature, the view of what makes a tribe um, allows for mixing. It allows for people to marry and people in out of one tribe and into another. It allows for people to be adopted. It allows for people to convert, and so um, the word ethnic today, it has this like post-Hitler kind of biological feel to it, you know, as though if you want a country that is that is English or French or Jewish or Arab, as though that means that no one will ever be allowed to participate in this society, unless they're born of pure blood or some nonsense like that. Okay, so that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the old meaning of nationality, where people knew how to, identify that the world is made up of different tribes and different nations. You can tell them apart because they have different languages, they have different religions, they have different histories, and people's group identity is formed in childhood by being part of a certain tribe and a certain nation and a certain family of nations also, the English speaking peoples, for example. And it simply is a fact that that of a fact about the political world, that wherever you see an organized society where where there are laws and there are traditions and they're being enforced, and people are there's some people are rebelling and some people are unhappy, but then there's some kind of process of either punishing them or compromising. Wherever you see an organized society, there's always some dominant group. Sometimes it's a coalition of groups, right? Like like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, even before it was called the Austro-Hungarian Empire, there were 15 different, 17, I don't remember the numbers, 17 different nations officially recognized in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but the Austrians, meaning the Germans, and the Hungarians, they were like a coalition. The Austrians and the Hungarians, like they were the top dogs, and so Germans were number one and Hungarians were number two, and then everybody else was. Look, this is the way all societies are everywhere. Okay, the only place where this doesn't happen is where people are pretending it's not happening. So what I try to get people to do is, first of all, let's let's give the people that we disagree with on the left, let's give them some credit when they are talking about the existence of power structures and social hierarchies and hierarchies among groups. That that's not complete nonsense. America really was governed by Anglo-Protestants up until after World War II. Just look at who the presidents were. I mean, that's true. There were other people, and some of them, like the blacks, really were persecuted, but others, weren't so persecuted. I really don't think you need to make, like, you know too big a deal about how awful America was for Jews when the Anglo-Protestants were running it. Are there things that I would have found offensive? Yes, but that's beside the point. America was still the best place in the world for Jews to live, for 200 years, even though it was run by Anglo-Protestants. And only a very small number of Jews could make it up to the highest echelons of society. So the critique that says, look, there really are social groups, and they really do compete with one another, and there really is a dominant group or coalition, and often it really isn't oppressive or unjust. Like all these things are true. The question is, once we recognize that it's true and that it's always true, that it's true in every society in the world, do we need to then become Marxists and say, well, our goal is to overthrow whoever's in charge and completely, utterly destroy them and hope for a utopia where there's not going to emerge any new dominant group or coalition of groups? I mean, that's just a terrible worldview.
Yeah, as though this utopia is going to lead to no concentration of power and no actual individuals are right. I mean, it's that's where it doesn't, especially when you're talking about large nation states and you're not talking about Marxism in a very small, like in the kibbutzes, when you talk about it in the context of a nation state, it's like you don't think there's going to be agglomerations and concentrations of power there. And then how are those going to be used? Those questions are absolutely paramount.
I was in the kibbutz where everybody was equal, but some people made the decisions and others,
Right.
everybody else didn't.
But isn't it interesting that we're still trying to work out this tension that the Bible talks about between tribal origin, tribal destiny, and then also a universal vision where there's room for, to treat everybody fairly. So the concept that we have to have universal human rights and so forth. But the way that you describe it, so having a dominant ethnic group with its values, interests, and so forth is not incompatible with also having equal treatment under the law, human rights, and so forth. Is that kind of, so you see these things as being best reconciled inside of the nation state, correct?
I mean, roughly, there's two choices. One choice is that is an imperial choice where you say the state is simply going to force everyone to be exactly what it is that it wants them to be. That's what happens in empires. Empires are never democratic. They're never democratic. They're always about trying to muster enough force to keep all the different peoples from being free. That's what empires are about. So within independent nation states, where there's a dominant ethnic or religious group or a coalition that's dominant, that's the arena in which you find different experiments for how can we set up a constitution so that all the different groups in society have some degree of representation, that there's some degree of fairness and justice, that you can say that everybody or most people are participating in. That only happens in nation states. We don't have examples other than independent nation states where that happens. It's the mutual loyalty that binds the different tribes and groups within the national state, that binds them to one another. That loyalty is what allows peaceful transitions of power to happen. If you don't have that kind of loyalty, you can't have peaceful transitions of power. That's what we're seeing in America, is that America is becoming less like a nation state and more like an empire. And as it becomes less like a nation state, the different groups allow themselves to hate each other more and more. And in the name of some theory about how we're going to make everything perfect, they're actually destroying everything.
This utopia and how seeing ourselves as part of a kind of a shared identity and a shared community will kind of lead to a dissolving, hopefully, of a war of all against all, or this group dominating that group. And that's kind of more and more what we're seeing in the US and in many other places as we kind of devolve into these ideologies that are trying to that see the other as an enemy that needs to be destroyed. I think we could learn a lot from this concept of nationalism and from this the shared vision that we once had in the West, but that seems to be waning in the last decade or so. Thank you very much, Yoram Hazony. It was a really, really fascinating discussion. I really appreciate your insights and your depth of thinking, and I really hope we get to talk again and hopefully meet in person one day.
God willing. Thank you for the time, and God bless you and your audience. We should everybody should have a Shana Tova, wonderful, peaceful New Year.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hazony. We'll speak soon.